everyone, and welcome to this explainer. If you are gearing up for an English exam on Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, well, you are in exactly the right place. Consider this your energetic Masterclass level cheat sheet. Now, we aren't here to just do a simple plot summary. I mean, you already know the story. Instead, we're going to dive deep into the underlying literary analysis, the character motives, and the precise contextual evidence that you need to really unlock this complex masterpiece and totally ace your essays. Let's get into it. To kick things off, let's pose the ultimate literary paradox. Is this book a moral tale, or is it a decadent manifesto? Just think about it for a second. This is a story that severely, brutally punishes its protagonist for a life of unchecked pleasure and sin. And yet, it was written by an author who famously advocated for exactly that kind of hedonism. It's a massive contradiction that absolutely baffled Victorian critics, and honestly, it's the exact tension that will fuel your very best exam arguments. And to really understand that tension, we have to look at the text's history. Because this work evolved a lot. It didn't start as the canonized, safe little paperback classic that we study today. No way. It was first published in July 1890 as a lead story in Lippitcott's monthly magazine, and it caused absolute outrage. I'm talking reviewers literally calling it a poisonous book fit only for the criminal investigation department. So to survive the hostile press, Wilde heavily revised and expanded it into the 1891 novel that we know now. Keep that evolution in mind. It's a super critical tool for your analysis. Here is the roadmap for our explainer today. 1. The philosophy of aestheticism. 2. Character archetypes and motives. 3. Hypocrisy and the double life. 4. Symbolism, portraits, and poison. And 5. Decoding Wilde's narrative choices. Okay, Section 1. The philosophy of aestheticism, art for art's sake versus morality. To really establish the conceptual foundation of the entire novel, we have to understand aestheticism. This was a late 19th century movement, asserting that art exists purely for its beauty alone, like completely devoid of any moral or didactic purpose. Art for art's sake. Wilde was the famous professor of this movement in London, and so the central question of the novel is what actually happens when you try to apply this artistic rule to a living, breathing human life. Wilde separates the spheres of ethical judgment and artistic appreciation, and Dorian basically tries to live entirely in the latter. Which brings us to this defining quote from Lord Henry Wotton: "To cure the soul by means of the senses, and the senses by means of the soul." Lord Henry preaches this new hedonism. He isn't just trying to make Dorian a corrupted youth. He's treating him as a literal psychological experiment. He wants to see what happens when a person truly lives only for sensation and beauty, totally free from the suffocating Victorian morality of the time. Section 2. Character archetypes and motives, colliding philosophies. What's brilliant here is how Wilde uses his characters. They aren't just living people. They act as stand-ins for specific, warring philosophies. This triangle of colliding worldviews is the perfect structure for any character-based exam question you might get. So you have Dorian as the aesthetic ideal, the experiment driven by extreme hedonism and eternal youth. Then you have Lord Henry as the corrupter, or the dandy, acting out of this detached, almost scientific, curiosity and manipulation. And finally, you have Basil Hallward as the moral conscience and the creator, who is driven by Platonic worship of beauty and artistic purity. To see these archetypes in action, just look at this incredibly chilling quote. This is Dorian's reaction to the suicide of Sybil Vane. He calls her death, quote, one of the great romantic tragedies of the age. He doesn't shed a single tear for a real human being. Instead, he applies an aesthetic, artistic response to a real-world tragedy. He views her like a character in a play, illustrating the absolute dangerous extreme of life-imitating art. Moving right along to Section 3, Hypocrisy and the Double Life, the Victorian Mask. Transitioning to Wilde's social critique, take a look at this line Dorian delivers to Basil. "We are in the native land of the hypocrite." Wilde is using Dorian to hold a giant mirror up to his readers. Dorian is not just some supernatural anomaly. He is an extreme embodiment of the unacknowledged norm in a society that was completely obsessed with outward respectability while quietly hiding its secret sins. Now, to understand why this double life was so terrifying to Victorians, we have to talk about physiognomy. This was a very real 19th century pseudoscientific belief that a person's secret vices and sins would visibly manifest on their face. Wilde takes this real medical and moral theory and supernaturalizes it. By placing the physical decay on the portrait instead of Dorian's actual body, Dorian gains the ultimate alibi, right? He can commit any crime, but his face remains perfectly pure, completely bypassing Victorian society's way of judging morality. So, the crucial point for your essay notes is how Wilde entirely collapses the distance between the respectable ruling class and the criminal outcast. Dorian moves seamlessly from the high culture of Mayfair to the low-life opium dens of Ratcliffe. Note also how Wilde weaves in the scientific principle of heredity. Dorian actually fears he is reverting to the criminal tendencies of his ancestors. And academically, this is a perfect place to draw a comparison to Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which was published just a few years earlier, and also explored the dual nature of respectable gentlemen harboring secret centers. Drop that in your essay for sure. Section 4. Symbolism, Portraits, and Poison. Let's decode the objects. Two main objects really dominate Dorian's life, and unpacking them drives the thematic weight of the text forward. On one hand, you have the portrait painted by Basil. It acts as this supernatural moral ledger, recording every single sin, ultimately becoming a terrifying conscience that haunts Dorian. On the other hand, you have the Yellow Book, given to him by Lord Henry. This acts as a poisonous catalyst, a literal blueprint of French decadence that maps out Dorian's ruin and encourages his descent into hedonism. It's basically conscience versus corruption. Look really closely at this textual evidence regarding the portrait. Here was a visible symbol of the degradation of sin. Here was an ever-present sign of the ruin men brought upon their souls. This proves that despite all of Lord Henry's aesthetic posturing, a deeply ingrained, almost inescapable moral conscience still haunts the narrative. Dorian tries so hard to live without morals, but the portrait forces him to see his own soul. And finally, Section 5. Decoding Wilde's narrative choices, looking at the 1890 versus the 1891 texts. Okay, so for true A-grade contextual mastery, you need to understand exactly why Wilde actively revised his own text between the magazine publication in 1890 and the novel release in 1891. Compare Basil's confession here. In the 1890 text, Basil says, "I quite admit that I adored you madly, extravagantly, absurdly." But in the 1891 text, Wilde changes it to, "You became to me the visible incarnation of that unseen ideal." Notice the shift there. Wilde deliberately censored the physical, romantic adoration. Actually, he replaced it with a safe, platonic, and artistic worship. He was actively trying to appease a Victorian moral panic that found his initial text way too revealing. Here is exactly what Wilde did to survive the censorship. Step 1, as we just saw, he toned down the physical intimacy and homoerotic undertones between the male characters. Step 2, he expanded on Dorian's psychological collapse and paranoia, which honestly made the book read more like a gothic psychological thriller. And step 3, he added entire chapters on Dorian's ancestry. Why? To give Dorian a scientific motive, like hereditary and degeneracy for his crimes, masking his dangerous autobiographical truths with medical determinism. So to summarize these really advanced analytical points for your exams, the text operates as a coded exploration of the Victorian homosexual subculture. The extensive revisions Wilde was forced to make, those are your hard evidence of the intense pressure and danger of 19th century censorship. And perhaps most poignantly, the entire concept of the double life ominously prefigures Wilde's own tragic trials and downfall just a few years later. Art didn't just imitate life, it predicted it. Which leaves us with one final, provocative thought to take into your exam room. When Dorian takes the knife to the canvas in the final scene, did he destroy the magical portrait, or did the conscience he tried so desperately to escape inevitably destroy him? I'll leave you to argue that in your essays. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Study hard, and I'll see you next time.